we caught none of that, but I'll start from scratch anyway. Can everybody see my screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. All right, wonderful. Let's try that again. So in this session, we are going to be covering 3 topics around job workflow processes, talent folder processes, and the rules engine. Jobs, of course, as represented by the tile here on the left on my dashboard, where you'd be processing active candidates through a job or recruitment process, an active recruitment process. Talent folders, indicated on the right here by the My Folders dashboard, are more for generating static lists or proactive lists of candidates that you might be pipelining for future recruitment activities. And we'll be looking at how to, from a more administrative perspective, how to configure the processes that sit behind both the jobs and the talent folders during this session, and also covering off how you can automate or introduce automation into those 2 areas using the rules engine. So let's dive in. As a recap, which is probably covered in a separate session, if we click into a particular job, we can see here that we're looking at a job details screen, which is covering all the details of a particular job. And this is configurable for client by client, and configuring this screen will be covered in a separate session. But on the top here, we can see the workflow that has been associated with this particular job. You can configure different workflows within your solution and then associate an appropriate workflow to each of the jobs that you're processing. You may want to have different workflows for things like your standard workflow, your standard recruitment processing versus perhaps some executive recruitment processing versus a graduate campaign or other ways of segmenting your recruitment activities. To drill down further into the applicants that are within this job, of course, we can click on Search Applicants, click on the 11 candidates who have applied link here, or in fact, click on the workflow process link itself. And I can now view the applicants that have applied to this particular job. And down the left here, we can see the job workflow process or recruitment funnel that has been associated with this particular job. And it is essentially a series of steps that candidates are going to move through as they progress through the recruitment process. And this is what we refer to as the workflow, and this is what we're going to see how you can configure today. We're also going to cover off automation with the rules engine, which is indicated here by these green folders. Any folders that are green have automations associated with those steps. And of course, I can drag candidates down through those steps by picking them up and moving them down the recruitment funnel. But we won't be going into the details of recruitment processing today, more around the configuration of this workflow. I'm going to leave this screen open for the moment, and I'm actually going to click on the rectangle to open a new tab so that I can now work simultaneously in 2 different windows, which is an option that you can use. And I'm going to go down to Administration, Process Designer. Within Administration Process Designer, I'm given a list of the workflow processes that have been configured for this particular solution. And you can see here the standard process with onboarding workflow is listed here. I can see who's created it, when, last modified, etc. From here, I can select a particular workflow process and choose to create a copy of it if I want to duplicate that process and make modifications for my next process, or I can choose to create a new process from scratch. And I can also delete processes as I go. For today, I'm going to click into this particular onboarding step workflow so that we can edit it and explore it in a little more detail. When you click into a workflow process, you can see some particulars about its name and description and so on, and you can choose to edit those. And then you are presented with a horizontal representation of each of the steps within that workflow. So you can see here, we're going from screening to assessment, video assessment, interview, panel, etc. The brackets here indicate application status codes that are associated with that particular step. As a candidate is moved through particular steps or statuses, that is tracked using a particular 3-letter code, and you can create these codes and associate them with these steps. So as I move a candidate from the interview step to the panel interview step, for example, the candidate's status would be updated from INT to PA2. We use that because a common status of, for example, INT or EMP for employed or NEW new for when they first enter the step, these status codes remain constant whilst they can be associated with different steps of the workflow. And that will make a little more sense shortly. So I'm just pointing it out at this point. Once we're here, we can add new steps to our workflow by clicking on the little arrow in between each step, or we can choose to delete or edit particular steps. What I'm going to do is click into this panel interview step and delete it. And then I'm going to recreate it. So you can see here the existing recruitment process. And if we go down and look at our existing process for this job, goes straight from interview to references. But we've decided that we want to introduce an additional step in the process, which is called the panel interview. So I'm going to click on the little arrow in between. I'm going to give it a name, panel interview, and I'm going to associate it with an application status code of panel interview. We'll go through how to create new application status codes later in this session, time pending, or in another session. You can also associate subfolders or sub-steps within this particular step if you wish. And this is used for more detailed processing, not by a lot of clients, but by some, to allow you to track a candidate who is in a particular workflow step, for example, panel interview, some sub-steps within that. So for example, they are still pending their panel interview, or they have passed or failed their panel interview, etc. And so this might be useful when you're doing background checks or assessment steps or particular steps like that, where you want to track where a candidate is up to within that particular step. You can update their sub-status or application stage whilst remaining in that particular overall status. I'll remove that for now. Oops. So I'm going to continue. And sorry, before I do that, there's also the opportunity to set a step as mandatory. What that means is if I jump back to my recruitment process, if I set up a particular step as mandatory, a little red star would appear against it. And it means that every candidate, as they progress through the recruitment process, must go through that particular step before they can move to any of the lower steps. This ensures compliance because it's forcing recruiters to move their candidates through a particular mandatory step, such as references, and also improves your reporting outcomes and reporting data because you are forcing each candidate to move through particular steps, which will improve your time to process or time to fill metrics, because they can't just be dropped directly from screening. No actual step changes are done and then drop straight to employed, for example. It's forcing you to move through those steps. But it can also introduce some administrative burdens because you have to drag candidates down through each of those steps. So you may want to use those pragmatically. I'm going to click continue here. That activity has been inserted. And if I exit out of this, I can now see that my workflow process includes this panel interview step. Drilling into it again, just looking at a few of the other automations that can be associated. There are some after time, quote unquote, after time automations that can be associated with each step in the workflow. So for example, you can enable reminders to be sent to the recruiter or to a third party by typing their email address. And those reminders will be sent out whenever a candidate has been placed in this particular step, in this case, the panel interview step, for more than, let's say, 3 days of inactivity, and then we can choose to remind that person every day up to 5 times. So if a candidate has ended up being stagnant in a particular workflow step and that is not appropriate for that process, then reminders can start to be sent out. Useful if, for example, the step has asked a candidate to complete a form, an online form, and they have not done so, you can send reminders out to the recruiter to get them to set up a follow-up. Alternatively, you can set up reminders directly to the candidate themselves, and similar kind of thing. You could, after 3 days of waiting for them to fill out a form, because this is, let's say it's a form completion step, you can choose which template you want to send them. So maybe it's the follow-up email template, and remind them after 5 days, and then, after 3 days, and remind them every day up to 3 times, and then stop spamming them, for example. So that is another automation option. And then the final automation option available here is for some candidate auto processing. Again, it's an after time automation. So after X number of days, you can choose to just move that candidate to a different workflow step or application status after X days of inactivity, and send an email to them at the same time. So useful, for example, if they have been put into a step where they have an option to accept or decline something, or to fill out something, and if they don't fill it out within X number of days, you're just going to automatically move them to the unsuccessful step or withdrawn step or something like that. So maybe the reject step, and with a reject reason. So again, some after time processing to move candidates around the system without recruiters needing to perform any particular activities. They are the basics of configuring a workflow process. And as you can see, by building up all of your workflow steps, we have now got a complete recruitment funnel. And that can be associated with different jobs. So we've now created a panel interview step. What I'm going to do now is just quickly jump back to our job. And you can see for this particular job, the panel interview step is not within that workflow, even though it is the standard processing with onboarding step that I have been modifying. What I can do here is I can choose to reset the workflow on a particular job at any time, and reassociate or reattach that same step. I could choose a different step a different process if I wish, but I'm going to attach the onboarding process again, assign that workflow. And now when I click in and view the candidates on that step, I can now see my panel interview folder has been added to the recruitment process. So that is the very basics of a recruitment process. What we'll do now is drill into the rules engine automation, which provides the next level and the most comprehensive level of automations that you can associate with your job recruitment process. Just as a reminder, I've come in from my process designer. So if I wanted to configure rules against and automations against my process, I can come in from the process designer to my workflows. I'm going to go back into my standard process with onboarding, where I can see all of my steps. And down here, I have a button called Manage Rules. This takes me to a new section or a different screen within the system, which allows me to set up automations and rules for this particular recruitment process. Down the left here, you can see each of the steps of that particular recruitment process. And within the middle here, instead of viewing candidates, it looks similar to the candidate processing screen, but instead of viewing candidates, I'm now viewing the rules that have been set up on each of these steps. And you can see here, I've got one rule that is set up on the screening step, one on the assessment step, et cetera, you can also see for each rule that's been created, what stage or step of the recruitment process they have been associated with. So on this particular workflow process, I've got 6 or 7 automations. First one is set up on the assessment step, which is the, or actually let's start with the one at the bottom here, the screening step, the first one. The rule name is right to work with a description of right to work. That rule is going to fire when the candidate enters that particular step, and it is an active rule. Let's drill into that in a little more detail and see what this automation is actually doing. So I can do that by editing that rule. And we're presented with a 4-step process where you are configuring what this particular automation is going to do. And as I go through this, hopefully the automations will become clear. The first step of the automation is defining when a particular automation will trigger, or on what action in the system will it trigger. And the rules engine automations are really about automating something when an action has occurred. Previously, we were talking about after time events, sending reminders or moving candidates after a period of time has elapsed. This rules engine automation is really about configuring automations to occur triggered by something happening in the system. So for example, this automation is going to happen when a candidate enters this particular step of the workflow process. So on entry, I'm going to click next. And on the next step, I can set up the conditions under which this rule will fire. So you can see that two filters or conditions have been set up here. The first is when do we apply this action? When the recruiter moves the candidate or when the rules engine moves the candidate. And normally we just select both of those for all rules, but it is an available option on all rules. It's basically saying that, do you want this automation to fire only when the recruiter moves the candidate, when someone has manually actioned the candidate, so a human has been involved in the process, or do you want the automation to fire also when the rules engine has moved the candidate due to a prior automation taking place, which is allowing you to chain rules together? And we thought when building this that there may be times where you would not want to have a particular action fire based on the robot firing a prior action, but in truth, most of the time for all of our automations, you just select both steps. And then next, we have got a filter on legal work status. So here we can see that this rule is going to fire whenever the candidate is not an Australian citizen. You may remember that we are editing a right to work step. So this, for all candidates who are not an Australian citizen, this rule will fire. I can add additional conditions here if I wish by clicking on Add Conditions, and I'm presented with a number of filters that have been set up within this solution. And we can configure as many of these as we want as an application support task. So one example might be a questionnaire or screening result of pass or fail, or a percentage score. So if screening questions are set up within the solution, we can score those and come out with a score of, for example, 60%. And I might want to set up an automation where I say that for all candidates where they get a questionnaire score of less than 50%, I am going to do something, which we'll see in the next step. So there are a number of different filters that you can configure for your rules, and we can add more if we need to. Let's go to the next step, which is actions. So far we've covered off when building our automation, when is it going to fire? When the candidate enters the step. Under what conditions will it fire? When the candidate is not an Australian citizen. And finally, what action is going to take place when all of those conditions are met? Of course, in this particular step, we are going to perform a change status action. So we're going to change the status of this candidate, and we're going to move them to a new status of reject. So we're going to reject all candidates who are not Australian citizens. So this particular role requires you to be an Australian citizen, for example. So I just remove that for a second. If I was creating a new rule, I would have achieved that by clicking on Add Action. And you can see here a number of different actions that can be set up through automations. Before going into them, I'll select Change Status. and I would choose to change the status to reject, the reject reason. In this solution, the reject reasons are free text enterable, but they can be drop downs of structured reject reasons for solutions if need be. And that's it, next. And then I can give my rule a name and a description, and it's active. I can get a summary of my rule, and then I can save my rule. So that automation is now in place. And you can see other automations that are here as well. So let's quickly have a look at a phone screen automation, which is active on the assessment step. So as soon as the candidate is moved into that assessment step of the workflow, just quickly going back to our candidate processing. So as soon as a candidate is moved into that assessment step, on entry to that step, for all candidates, you can see there are no additional filters here, just the one about whether it's the recruiter or the rules engine, but every candidate who moves into that step will have an online form generated for them, which is the phone interview form. So if I quickly jump back and click into that assessment step and view a particular candidate, Alexandra Jones, and I go to the Forms tab, maybe that was not associated before I went, that form would normally have been automatically generated as the candidate moved into that step. Maybe we'll just try verifying that. Move out of that step. This is a very old process within our demonstration solution, so hopefully everything is still running correctly. So I've moved the candidate into that step, and there's no form. It's not ideal, probably in our demonstration solutions. But you get the idea, hopefully, that when moving a candidate in and there's a rule in place, it will automatically generate that phone interview online form, and online forms will be covered in a separate training topic. But for this one, I've generated an online form, click next, and saved that particular rules engine automation. If we jump back and have a look at some of the other ways that you can trigger actions to take place, why don't we go ahead and create a new rule on the assessment step. So far, I've talked about on entry rules. So that's when a candidate enters a particular step, then a rule will happen. But there are other trigger points that can be set up, and you simply click the button for the one that you want to set up. So for example, another common one is on sending an email. So when an email is sent to a candidate, then we want to do something. So a common scenario there might be if the recruiter chooses to manually contact or send an email to the candidate, then on sending that particular email, we can set up the next automation in the solution. So for example, on sending an email, let's say that I want to apply the action anytime, and I'm going to set up an email filter for this particular rule of, let's say it's the unsuccessful email. So when I send a reject email to a candidate, then I'm automatically going to change the status of that candidate to reject. So by setting up this particular automation, I'm allowing my recruitment process or my recruiters to say, I'm going to email my candidate to say, unfortunately, you've been unsuccessful for this position, and then the system will automatically move them to the unsuccessful step. But you could use that for any number of different emails. For example, anytime an email to please fill out a form is sent, they're going to move them to another step in the process, as an example. Other trigger points are when, and these are the two most common ones, by the way, on entry and on send email. Other trigger points are when results are received for a particular assessment, for example. Then you can automate something, and I'll chain two of those together in a second. When a form is submitted, so on submitting a form, we can process candidates based on that and move them to the next step of the process. And there are other ones on feedback submitted. So when hiring managers submit feedback into the system, we can automatically move candidates around. And then a few more quite specific ones for specific assessments and so on as well. So they are some of the different trigger points. And what I'll do is I'll quickly build two rules to show you those in just a second. The other options that we haven't covered are the different actions. So when a rule is going to fire, you get different actions depending on where you're setting up your automation, but common ones are to, obviously I've shown, move the candidate to a different status. You can link them to a different job if you want to move them around. So that might be useful, for example, when you're having a pool requisition where candidates apply to a single pool job, and then depending on what location they're interested in working for, maybe it's London or Bristol or Sydney or Melbourne, you could move them off to link them to a sub job and start processing them on location specific or maybe work preference specific areas. So useful for pool requisitions. So change status, link to requisition. You can send them an email. You can generate a form. You can move them to a different folder, etc. So all sorts of things that you can do. So why don't we quickly go ahead and create two steps that are chained together. So for example, I'm going to create a rule when candidates enter the interview step. I'm going to set up on entry for all candidates. I'm going to set up a third-party assessment, and it's going to be our Montage video interview assessment, for example. Just reaching out to Montage to get their list of assessments. Hoping this is going to come back. Might be a problem with our communication with Montage. There we go. This is our demo solution. So I'm going to set up an on-demand video. So this is basically setting up a Montage assessment. So this is my video interview step. And then I'm going to set up a second automation on this particular step, create rule for when the results of that are received. So on results received, and if my Montage overall score is less than 2, then I am going to automatically change their status to reject. Low score from video interview, reject. And I'll set up one more rule on results received. If the Montage interview is greater than 2, whatever it was, these are the successful candidates, and I'm going to send them an email thanking them for completing the step perhaps, or change their status to the next step in the process, which might have been references. Move candidate to reference, check on successful interview. So there you can see I've quite quickly created 3 rules on the interview step which chain together. So on entry to the step, we're going to generate the video interview. And then on receiving the results from that video interview, we're going to automatically move them to the reject step or the next step in the process, which is references. And by building a series of rules, you can chain an automation that will move candidates right through the process with very little involvement from the recruitment team. So it really does reduce the amount of manual effort required on the step, and also improves compliance. Once you've created all of your rules, you can choose to synchronize those rules out to existing jobs. So as I mentioned, a recruitment workflow has, a job has a workflow on it and rules associated with that. When a job is created, those rules are effectively copied onto that particular job. So at the time that the workflow is stamped onto the job, all of these rules are copied onto this particular job and are active, and they're indicated by the green folders here. So you can see, even if I perform a refresh, the 3 new steps that I've created, 3 new automations that I've created on interview are not yet on this job because the job is already in process, so they're not automatically added. However, if I wanted to synchronize, make changes to my workflow process and synchronize those rules out, I could click on the sync rules option, and that would push these 3 new rules out to that existing job. Alternatively, if I go back and reset my workflow like I did earlier and restamp the same workflow, click in. Is that the right one? Maybe I was actually doing a different step. I would have expected to see those. Actually, maybe I chose a different step there. What did I choose? Oh, I chose the wrong one. I chose the AGD. Let's try that again. Standard process with onboarding. I still don't see those. Still don't see those rules that have come through, but I would have expected those rules to come through on resetting that workflow. Not sure what happened there. Maybe it's because I'm working in a separate window or something. That's unexpected. But you get the idea that when you reset the workflow, those rules should come through. Drilling back up, we're back up to our workflow process, and here we are. So again, just to reinitialize where we are, we're on our workflow process, and we can manage our rules. We can also choose to update jobs here. So for our workflow process, if we've got our workflow process and we've made changes to it, either for the steps that are in the workflow process or we've changed the rules that are associated with that workflow process, we can click the Update Jobs button, and that will automatically push this workflow back out and synchronize with all of the jobs that are associated. So I've shown you 2 ways now where I can update the workflow process for a specific job by resetting it, or coming at it from the other way. If I've made modifications to my workflow process and I know that I want to push those changes out to all live jobs, I can click the Update Jobs button, and that will push that particular workflow process change back out to all of those jobs in a bulk scenario. So that covers the basics of workflow processing and the rules engine. The rules engine really is an area where we have, for our clients, had either the clients themselves or through our support team implemented a lot of solutioning and recruitment process automation using this solution. So I encourage you to get familiar with it and think about ways that you can use that to really automate your recruitment process. We'll move on now to, so I've now covered the basics of job workflow processes and rules engine automation. The final topic that I wanted to cover today was the workflow or the processes that sit behind our static lists of candidates. So jumping right back to the top where we've got our dashboard, we've got our My Jobs, and we've got our My Folders. Talent folders and jobs are quite similar in that it is a bucket where a series of candidates are maintained. But in this scenario, we are pipelining candidates that are interested in a project management position, but may not have necessarily applied for an active job. They're just a list of project managers that I know of, that I actively communicate with, so that when a project management position comes available, I can reach out to my project managers that I know of, see if they're interested in applying, and hopefully convert them to a candidate that has applied to a specific opportunity, such as this one over here that's an active project management job. So if I click into my folder, I can now see, once again, a series of candidates that are within that process, within that talent folder, and I can view the details of them and process them and send emails and so on as I normally would. I won't go into that in today's topic. But once again, over here on the left, we can see a series of steps or checkpoints or statuses that the candidate can be placed into. Less like a recruitment funnel, even though it looks similar to what was set up for job processing. In this scenario, typically the folders are less like a recruitment funnel. They're more about keeping track of candidates that you are communicating with as potential project managers through different steps, and they could be anything. So in this one, suspect and verified suspect are sourcing terms. Doesn't mean that they're a suspect candidate or someone that we're watching or we're concerned about. It's more that they are someone that we suspect might be interested in the role. When I've given them a call and chatted to them and confirmed that they have the right skills and they're interested in working for my company, I might move them down into a verified suspect step, knowing that I've spoken to them at least once and they are interested. Or a qualified prospect or suspect might be someone who I have put through some kind of a pre-qualification or assessment, and I know that they are qualified to perform the role. They are a couple of examples. Networkers, another, again, part of our sourcing team has set this up. They are people who are actively engaged in the market, so that if I have a need for a project manager, my networkers are maybe people who could help me reach out and find good project managers. So they are the current steps. You've got successful steps. So for example, if I've already gone ahead and placed this candidate on an active role, I might want to move them into this place step so that I know that they've already been placed on a role. Or I've got unsuccessful steps, if I wish, for candidates who are either not suitable or not interested in my position. So for today, we'll quickly have a look at how we can configure, again, workflow processes for talent folders. To do that, actually, I'll jump back to my other screen. I'll go to administration, and this time I'm going to go to the admin console, and I'm going to choose the talent folder processes screen. And once again, you can see a list of talent folder processes that have been set up within this solution. And here is one for example, our talent pipeline. To edit that, I can see a little bit of information about it. For example, there are 7 steps within this particular pipeline, and there are 20 talent folders or static lists that are utilizing this particular workflow process. And very similar to job processes, so I won't go through this one in quite as much detail, but by clicking on the pencil, I can now start to edit and add the steps that are within this particular process. I can give it a name. I can define that it's active. I can define that it is the default workflow process. So that means that as I create new talent folders or static lists, this is the one that will be associated automatically. And then I can view the current steps that are available. And I can also, within talent folders, configure more than one successful step and more than one unsuccessful step and define them here. So I've got my current, my successful, and my unsuccessful steps. And I can choose to add a step, or I can edit an existing step. So here are my verified suspects. So let's say that I don't like the word suspect. It doesn't work for me. I can change that to prospect, might be a better term. I can choose which group it's going to be put into, the current, the unsuccessful or unsuccessful grouping. Once again, I can make a step mandatory. And then once again, I've got some process automation options as well, similar to what we looked at earlier. So I can choose, for example, that after 30 days that a candidate has been in a particular step, I can move the candidate to another step. So clearly they're not interested. Or alternatively, after 30 days, I can start to send email reminders to either the owner of that talent folder or to the recipient. I think the talent folder owner, that is the yeah, send it to the recipient, send an email asking them, to update their process or update their profile or whatever it may be. So some basic options for automation within the talent folder process as well. That pretty much covers the configuration of talent folder processes. Depending on the solution that you're building, may not be used as much, and probably the administration not as common. You may just set up one talent folder process and use that one. There is no rules engine automation on your talent folders. So as candidates move through particular steps, there's no automation there because candidates don't typically move through steps. We are looking at adding automation so that as candidates enter a talent folder, we can, for example, automatically send them an email, but that's not available at the moment. So the only automations that are in talent folder processes are after time events. You can send emails to either the talent folder owner or the candidate to get them to update their details or keep in touch with them. So in this session, we have covered our job process reminders, our workflow processes. We've covered some after time events that can be associated with each of our workflow steps. For example, reminding recruiters or candidates to send out emails if they're in a step too long. We've looked in detail at the rules engine and the automation of that, and we've looked at talent folder processes. Just quickly to close out on one final area, you may remember that going back to the job processes and looking at the workflow at the beginning, I mentioned that there are application status codes that are associated with each of those workflow steps. You can configure those as a one-off activity, won't happen very often. Here in the admin console, application admin, and you can choose to administer your application statuses. So here are a list of all of those status codes that are available within the solution, and you can choose to add new ones to this solution. So by adding, you can add a new code, let's call it, I don't know, YYY, and give that a label, Y, and a description and an order. So that is for adding new application status codes. So if you're setting up a workflow process, just opening a new window here, going back to my job process designer, onboarding. If I wanted to add a new interview step in here, maybe called, I don't know, interview 3, and I wanted to call it IN3, but I didn't have an IN3 code set up, I can come in here and I can set up an IN3 code and set it up ready to go. So that pretty much closes out the final step that I mentioned earlier around workflow processes. That pretty much concludes everything that we were looking to cover in this training session around configuring workflow processes, talent folder processes, and the rules engine. Are there any questions that people have about any of those topics that you'd like to ask now? Okay, doesn't look like there are any questions. So I want to thank you for your time. Hopefully that was useful as you start to build recruitment processes and think about how you want to process candidates, especially through your active jobs. I would encourage you to consider the rules engine automation as we work with our various clients, solutions, and partners. We are very often utilizing the rules engine and the automation to be able to set up recruitment processes that are efficient, effective, and compliant. And that is really one of the ways that we do it. And it's a good area to get to know. With that, we'll close the session and look forward to meeting you all on other session topics in the future. Thanks very much for your time.
Dave.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks
Appreciate
a
it.
lot.
Thanks, Dave.
Thank you.